And turn it back on. That will help too. Praise the Lord, everyone. We're going to continue with our study in the book of Esther. So we won't have the scriptures on the board today, but everything, I think everything, there might be a chapter or a verse or two outside of Esther. I am suddenly forgetting where Esther is. There we go. I found it. Okay. It's still there. So let's quickly review what we've learned, what we studied so far before we pick up on the next portion. King Ahasuerus deposed Queen Vashti because she refused to come when he called for her. He then had the young virgin women of his empire come to the palace so he could decide which one would be the new queen. Esther, who is also known as Hadassah, was chosen. She was Jewish but presented herself as if she were Persian. Her adoptive father Mordecai, who was also her cousin, had told her to hide her heritage, and she always followed Mordecai's guidance. Haman, Boo-Hiss, was placed over the princes of the empire and was angry that Mordecai didn't bow to him in respect. Because he knew that Mordecai was Jewish, Haman convinced the king to make a commandment that all the Jews of the empire would be killed. Mordecai communicated to Esther that she should ask the king to spare the Jewish people. Esther was reluctant at first, but she ended up asking Mordecai and the Jewish people in Shushan, the city where the palace was located, to fast with her 3 days, and she would then go in to see the king. And one of the important things that Mordecai said to her is pretty central to the book of Esther, and usually when we're studying it, is he says, "You may have been brought into the kingdom for such a time as this. But this is her purpose." So she asked the Jewish people to fast with her 3 days, and then she would go in to see the king. And it was unlawful to go to see the king unless either, one, the king requested it, or when the king saw you approaching, he extended a scepter to you. And if the scepter was not extended, the person approaching the king would be killed. We learned that God is not mentioned in the book of Esther, but his hand is still revealed. We also talked about 2 topics of hiddenness and timing. So now we're ready to start. We're picking up in chapter 5. And let's read verses 1 and 2.
Now it came to pass on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house, over against the gate of the house. And it was so, when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter.
Okay, so last week, not last week, it's been a while now. But last time we talked about Esther, we talked about her name Esther representing hiddenness, and the name Hadassah representing righteousness. And Esther's self-protection, where she told Mordecai, "If I go into the king, I'm going to die." Her self-protection said, "Stay hidden." That she chose that path of righteousness. She took the risk to go before the king on behalf of her people. And, we talked about timing too. She didn't choose this path in her own timing. She fasted, and while what we said, it's not specifically stated, I believe she prayed for wisdom and guidance from God. And we discussed these two scriptures when we were talking about the hand of God in Scripture. We studied these out. We studied that the scepter was a symbol of power and authority, but it also represents grace. It's a symbol of acceptance. And then Esther touching the scepter is an acceptance of that grace. So the king says, I accept you coming into my presence. I'm giving you grace. I'm not going to kill you. And her touching the scepter is accepting that grace, is recognizing, I know you didn't have to do this, and I thank you. This is an example to us of the grace and the power that God extends to us. So the king told Esther she could have whatever she wanted, up to half of the kingdom. What we've learned so far about King Ahasuerus is he appears to love wealth and power. We've talked about how he wanted to go into Greece, and he wanted to extend his kingdom, his empire, even bigger than it was already. We also, which I just said, okay. But we also learned from history. That was from history that we learned that he was interested in expanding his empire. But here, he's expressing a willingness to share his power. If Esther really had up to half of his kingdom, she would be just as powerful as he. And this reminds us of Jesus' words to us in John 14, verse 14. Let's look at actually verses 12 through 14.
Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that believeth on me,
Mm-hmm.
um, the work that I do shall he also do. The greater work than those shall he do, because I go unto my Father, and whatsoever ye shall ask in my name, that will I do, that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If ye shall ask anything in my name, I will do.
So here Jesus was telling them they would do works, that the same works that he did, and even greater. And also, like this king here, whatever you ask, it's yours. If you shall ask anything in my name, I will do it. So what Esther asked for, go back to Esther chapter 5. It's still there. I found it again. What Esther asked for at this time was for the king and Haman to come to a banquet. And that's going to be verses 5 and 6. I'll read that one. Then the king said, Cause Haman to make haste, that he may do as Esther hath said. So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And the king said unto Esther at the banquet of wine, What is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? Even to the half of the kingdom it shall be performed. So at first you see there, King Ahasuerus doesn't want to wait. He tells Haman, hurry up, get over here, and let's have this banquet. He was eager to hear what Esther might ask for. And he was eager to provide any request that was in his power. And he repeats that in verse 6. He says the same thing he said before. even to the half of the kingdom it shall be performed. In verse 7, then answered Esther and said, my petition and my request is. So you might think this time and place is right here for Esther to make her request known, reveal herself, say who she is, say who Haman is. Because King Ahasuerus has said, I'll grant you anything. I'll grant you even up to the half of the kingdom. But she just happened to delay the timing of her request. So let's read verse 8.
If I have found favor in thy sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition, and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king has said.
So it's not clear here whether Esther always planned to have two banquets. It actually looks like she might have made this decision in that moment. And she says that I shall prepare. You know, she didn't make it clear at the beginning that we'll have this first one. It'll just be a nice little light meal, and then we'll have, there was nothing like that in the Bible written about that. And this is another example of our relationship with God and what He would like it to be. He's ready to provide whatever we ask, and we hesitate to ask because of our fear that He won't answer. And we might even think He'll be angry for asking. Hebrews 4:16 tells us that is not the case. Yes.
Let us therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in the time of need.
Amen. So, like she went before King Ahasuerus, she was kind of out in the outer court, sort of maybe even hedging her bets. Like, well, I can say I was just walking by. If he decides that I shouldn't have been there, no, I didn't. I wasn't coming to see you. I was really doing this. We don't know. But this verse tells us to come boldly before unto the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Amen. So Haman was happy about being invited to this banquet. I'm going to go back to Esther. On his way home to tell his family and friends how special he was, he saw Mordecai. And Mordecai didn't acknowledge Haman in any way. And this made Haman angry again. Haman continued on to his home and explained to everyone what happened. He left the palace joyful and with a glad heart. And even after returning home and bragging about all the good that was happening in his life, Haman couldn't get past his feelings about Mordecai. We're going to read verses 12 to 14, chapter 5. Yay.
Yes. The queen did, let no man come in with the king unto the banquet that she has prepared myself, and tomorrow am I invited unto her also with the king. Yet all this availeth me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate.
Yes, 14 too.
Then said
Zeresh,
his wife, and all his friends unto him, let the gallows be made of 50 square Mordecai made to hang there. Then go in merrily with the king unto the banquet, and the thing pleased Haman, and, and he caused the gallows to be made.
So this is in the evening after he's had this meal. I'm saying evening. I don't know that it says evening in here. But he's had this meal, this banquet. That banquets are usually in the evening. He goes home and he talks about all these great things that are happening, but he can't really enjoy them because of somebody else. This other external thing. If only this wasn't going on, then I could be happy. And his wife and his friends, oh my goodness. Well, just kill him. Then you'll be fine. Get rid of him, everything will be great. Mordecai thinks that's a great idea, and that day he has this gallows made. He hasn't talked to the king. He hasn't asked the king anything about having Mordecai. I always do that. About having Mordecai killed. He just decided he was going to do this. Yes.
If it was at night, if he told them to build it, how could they build it at night? I'm thinking that it took a really long time. 50 cubits, I don't know how that is.
So
it's pretty high, I assume.
50 cubits is about 75 feet high. But it's so I have a little bit about the gallows. I don't know what kind of light they used. I don't know if they had lanterns and things like that they could hang. I don't know. Did not look into that. But a gallows is a frame, and it usually has, back then in particular, has two. We think of gallows as you go up the steps, and it has a trap door and all that. It doesn't sound like that was as elaborate as that back then. It was usually a frame with two standing wooden beams, and then a beam across the top, and then you attach the rope to it. And that was where the person was hanged by the noose from that rope, from that beam. It wouldn't have taken long to build. And this one was about 75 feet high, which would have made it visible to everybody. So everybody would have known what is he doing over there, especially, as you say, if it's at night. What is all that ruckus over there? So while this is happening, it just happened, right? Just happened that the king couldn't sleep that night. So to help him sleep, he asked that someone read his chronicles to him. And we have in the Bible, there's First and Second Chronicles, right? This is a different Chronicles. A chronicle is a record of something that happened, and it's written in chronological order, and it usually doesn't have any commentary. It's just telling you just the facts. This is what happened. And King Ahasuerus might have thought that reading about his achievements would put him in a good mood and help him sleep. Many think he was just looking for something boring to be read to him, kind of like counting sheep to get to sleep. But for whatever reason, it just happened, again, that while they were reading, he heard that Mordecai had reported that two of the king's chamberlains were plotting to kill the king. We learned about this last week when we were studying in the second chapter of Esther, that it kind of mentioned it, and it said the two chamberlains that had been plotting were killed. So Ahasuerus noticed there was no record of honoring Mordecai for saving the life of the king. And he asked, well, wait, what was done for Mordecai? The servants told him there was no honor given to Mordecai for the act. Ahasuerus' main concern at the time was to kill the men who plotted against him. And at this same time, it just happened that the king knew, he overheard or saw, there was someone in the outer court. Let's read chapter 6, verses 4 through 6.
And the king said, Who is in the court? Now Haman was come into the outer court of the king's house to speak unto the king to hang Haman on the gallows.
Hang Mordecai.
Mordecai, now I'm doing like
Yep.
Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. The king's servant said unto him, Behold, Haman standeth in the court. And the king said, Let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king said unto him, What shall be done unto the man who the king delighteth to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, To whom would the king delight to do honor more than to himself?
Mm-hmm. So I wonder if Haman slept that night. Bible doesn't tell us, but we know that he went ahead and had that gallows built, and it appears he got up early and was waiting in the outer court to see if he could meet with the king. And remember, the whole purpose of this visit was to ask that Mordecai be hanged on the gallows. Haman had already built. I got it built. It's all ready. Just need your approval. Haman had been promoted over all the princes. He was having exclusive banquets with the king and the queen. And he naturally thought the king wanted to honor him even more. Verse 6 tells us that he thought in his heart he would be the most likely person for the king to honor. And Jesus warns us in Mark chapter 7, verses 21 to 23, about what comes from the heart. It says, For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lasciviousness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within and defile the man. So Haman thought the king was hiding his intent to honor Haman. He couldn't think of anyone more deserving of honor than himself, so he asked for only the best. Verses 8 through 10. He said, Let the royal apparel be brought, which the king useth to wear, and the horse that the king rideth upon, and the crown royal which is set upon his head. And let this apparel and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man withal, whom the king delighteth to honor, and bring him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaim before him, Thus shall be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. Then the king said to Haman, Make haste, and take the apparel and the horse, as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew, that sitteth at the king's gate. Let nothing fail of all that thou hast spoken. This is the second time the king has told Haman to act quickly. First time was going to the banquet. But both times were in giving honor to God's people, to Esther and to Mordecai. Haman was okay with hurrying to the banquet given by the queen because he could go back to his people and brag about how important he was in that situation. But this one was different. He had a plan, and a plan to make himself happy, because he couldn't be happy unless this Mordecai was not around anymore. That whole plan just happened to be thwarted. He now had to take his enemy Mordecai through the streets of the city, declare that Mordecai was being honored by the king. And if you notice, in verse 9, he said, "Let this apparel and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes." That's who he was. He was placed above all the other princes. So he got what he asked for. uh, so he had to take Mordecai through the streets of the city and declare that Mordecai was being honored by the king. He couldn't see it any other way except as being humiliating to himself. Let's look at verses 11 and 12.
Then took Haman the apparel and the horse and the arrayed Mordecai, and brought him on horseback through the streets of the city, and proclaimed before him, "Thus shall it be done unto the man whom the king delights to honor." And Mordecai came again to the king's gate, and Haman hastened to his house, mourning and having his head covered.
Okay. So Mordecai Mordecai had started out earlier in this story at the gate, and he was mourning and he was in sackcloth and ashes. And he now has been honored. He's gone through the whole city, he's been honored. And then they brought him back to the gate. He goes back to what he was doing before. Haman is now in mourning because he's humiliated, right? So these verses remind me of James chapter 4, verses 8 through 10. It says, "Submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw nigh to God, and he will draw nigh to you. Cleanse your hearts, ye sinners, and cleanse your hands, ye sinners, and purify your hearts, ye double-minded. Be afflicted and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning, and your joy to heaviness. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up." James chapter 4, verses 8 through 10. James calls on us to purify our hearts. And we read earlier, Jesus told us what comes from the heart, but the heart can be cleaned. We can purify our hearts. These verses about being afflicted and mourning apply to Mordecai. He humbled himself before God, and God raised him up. When Mordecai mourned, he mourned for all the Jewish people. Haman's mourning was different. He was mourning what he saw as his own humiliation and his loss of power. And his friends and family looked at him differently too. We're going to read verses 13 and 14. So Haman goes back and he says, Haman told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had befallen him. Then said his wise men and Zeresh his wife unto him, "If Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shalt surely fall before him." And while they were yet talking with him, came the king's chamberlains, and hasted to bring Haman unto the banquet that Esther had prepared. That timing thing. Hurry, come on. Moving on to the next thing. But his friends and family, "Ooh, you're in trouble now, buddy. It is over for you." But you can't linger on that thought because he needs to hurry up and get to the second banquet. Chapter 7, verses 1 and 2.
So the king and Haman came to the banquet, and Esther the queen, with Esther the queen. And the king said again unto Esther, unto the second day, on the second day of the banquet of wine, "What is thy petition, Queen Esther?" and it shall be granted thee, and what is thy request, and it shall be performed, even unto the half of the king.
So this is the third time the king has told Esther essentially the same thing. If she'd only ask, he would give her anything she wanted. Esther now takes this time to be fully vulnerable before the king and tell him exactly who she is and what she needs. Read verses 3 through 5.
Then Esther the queen answered and said, if I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, and I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen and bondmen, and I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not contradict
Countervail.
countervail,
It basically means counteract.
countervail the king's damage. Then the king
Nope. Oh, wait, let's wait there. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. You're right. Yep, the next one.
Then the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, who is he, and where is he? The dust perform, dares
Presume.
presume in his heart to do so.
Okay. So Esther Esther hasn't said yet who she is exactly. She repeated the words that were used in the commandment that described how her people were to be treated, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish, which sounds very legal. You know, we got to cover all the different ways we can say it, but it all says basically the same thing. And the king's answer to her shows he was confused. And we don't know. He says, "Who is he? Where is he? What is this about? You know, who's presuming to do this?" He may have written quite a few of these commandments, couldn't keep them straight. Maybe he didn't really know what was going on in his empire. He signed things but didn't really know what they said. He also asks who has presumed this in his heart. So maybe he doesn't know that this was a commandment he signed. It might have just been he thought somebody else was thinking they would do this. So let's read verses 6 and 7.
And Esther said, the adversary and the enemy is with Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen.
Yes.
And the king arising from the banquet to a banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden. And Haman stood up and made request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil demonstrated against him,
Determined
against him by the king.
So in earlier parts of this story, the king seemed to be quick to get rid of somebody he felt was against him. He got rid of Vashti. He got rid of the chamberlains that were plotting against him. But here he gets up angry and he goes to the garden. It's likely that he now knows that Esther is talking about Haman's request and the king's commandment for all the Jews to be killed. And in this empire, laws that were established by the king couldn't be reversed. And that's what earlier when it said that the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. He said what the king had already decided couldn't be reversed. So Ahasuerus didn't have an easy way to answer Queen Esther's request. She requested first for herself, but also for her people. So again, another one of those times where she's not just thinking about herself. But Ahasuerus might have gone to the garden to think about, how can I both save Esther and punish Haman? Punishing Haman would be easy. He could make up a reason. I mean, he's done this. He's killed people, right? And Haman now, he's not concerned about his status, about whether he's over or under or whatever. He is begging for his life. And when the king returns to the room, Haman has fallen on Esther. And Ahasuerus believes that he's trying to rape her. So as they're dealing with Haman, there's some chamberlains there. As they're dealing with Haman, another chamberlain just happens to speak up. Chapter 7, verses 9 and 10. It says, and Harbona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman hath made for Mordecai, who hath spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. This tells us with Haman, who carried this anger, carried this wrath. If we carry wrath in our hearts, it will destroy us rather than our enemy. So we're going to move on to chapter 8. In chapter 8, the king gives Esther all that belonged to Haman. Esther tells the king of her relationship to Mordecai, and Mordecai is made the manager of Haman's household. And we're going to read Esther coming before the king again. And this time she's more bold when she approaches. This is going to be chapter 8, verses 3 through 6.
And Esther spake yet again before the king, and fell down at his feet, and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman and the
Agagite.
and his devices that he had devised against the Jews. Then the king held out his golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king, and said, if it please the king, and if I have found favor in thy sight, and the thing which seemeth good before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes, let it be written in reverse, the written
The letters devised.
devised by Haman, the son of
Medatha,
Metatha,
the Agagite.
Agagite, which had wrote to destroy the Jews, which are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that shall come unto my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kingdom?
So Esther was in a place now where she knew the love that King Ahasuerus had for her. She was more secure in his love and in who she was in his sight. She came right in and fell at his feet. This is another example of God's love for us, our acceptance of that love, and our learning to love and trust him. So the king's response is in verse 8. He says, write ye also for the Jews as it liketh you, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's ring. For the writing which is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring may no man reverse. So this is him telling them to write what they want to make it right, but they can't completely reverse the law that was written before. And the king can't reverse it either. So on the 23rd day of the third month, the king's scribes came together. They wrote a commandment to the Jews, letting them know that the king granted them the ability to defend themselves against anyone who came against them. And that was what was commanded to happen on the 13th day of the 12th month, we talked about before. My question I had was, why wouldn't the Jews have defended themselves anyway?
Because he was so powerful, they scared they could use him. Because wasn't he very powerful king?
Well, it's not made real clear, but I believe that any organizing of the Jews to defend themselves, see, they had a lot of time, right? So they said, this is going to happen way out here. They had a lot of time, and I believe any organizing they would have done would have been seen as a revolt against the king. And then they would be killed. They'd be killed for a different reason, and maybe faster than what the law said. So, verse 17 said, "And in every province and in every city, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. And many of the people of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them." So before this commandment, the Jewish people were seen as troublemakers. They didn't follow the laws before this latest commandment. They didn't follow the laws of the empire. But now that they were given the ability to protect themselves, others were scared of them. They're like, "Oh, I'm Jewish too. I want to be Jewish. Can I be Jewish?" We'll read chapter 9, verses 1 through 4. It says, "Now in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and his decree drew near to be put in execution, the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, though it was turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them that hated them. The Jews gathered themselves together in their cities throughout all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus, to lay hand on such as sought their hurt, and no man could withstand them, for the fear of them fell upon all people. And all the rulers of the provinces, and the lieutenants, and the deputies, and officers of the king helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went out throughout all the provinces, for this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater." Remember what Haman was. Haman was over all the princes. And so Mordecai was given control of all the things that Haman had control over. And it says here he waxed greater and greater, which became greater and greater. But many of the people who were excited about this day of getting rid of the Jewish people changed their minds when the latest commandment came out. But there were still those who wanted to enforce the first commandment, to kill the Jews. And they were destroyed. This is verse 5. "Thus the Jews smote all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, and slaughter and destruction, and did what they would unto those that hated them." And we learn, if you read on there, it says that they killed their enemies, but they didn't take any of the spoil. What spoil was their valuables. And this is showing they're not like the king and his people. They're not greedy for money. They're just trying to survive here. Then Mordecai wrote more letters to the Jewish people. He wrote to them about how to recognize this day. And that's in verses 20 to 22. It says, "And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters unto all the Jews that were in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus, both nigh and far, established this among them, that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and the 15th day of the same, yearly, as the days wherein the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month which was turned unto them from sorrow to joy, and from mourning into a good day, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and of sending portions one to another, and gifts to the poor. So this is what the first letter was about. And then he wrote a second letter, part of which read this. And this is in verse 28. So when I said he wrote another letter, the first one was a commandment. This is letters that he's writing now. So he wrote this letter telling them how to recognize the day. And then the second letter, part of it said, and that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, every city, and that these days of Purim should not fail from among the Jews, nor the memorial of them perish from their seed. Sorry, I had to think about how to say that because I used to say Purim, but it's Purim. And chapter 10 is a short chapter that explains that the king laid a tribute on the land, which means he taxed them. So some things still didn't change. He still wanted his money. Chapter also describes that Mordecai became second to the king and continued to seek good for the Jewish people. Purim is still celebrated in the Jewish religion today. They read the book of Esther on the eve before Purim and then on the next day. And this is when they have everyone say, boo, hiss, every time they hear the name Haman. They also have a tradition to give money to at least 2 poor people and send gifts of 2 different kinds of food to at least 1 person. And of course, there's a feast.
So what happened to Esther? They said like this, she wasn't wealthy like Mordecai, like she just got taken out.
No, she was still the queen. I mean, it doesn't say that, but yeah.
Because I'm like saying, he didn't recognize her.
Right.
You're not doing her. Just as she was recognized as for them being not killed.
Right.
And then after that, it's kind of like she was the queen. People didn't recognize.
Right.
I don't know if there's more about her in the Bible.
There's not anything more about her in the Bible. Yeah. So, but the idea of a woman back then being the one that made this decision and did, not made this decision is not the right wording, but that was a leader in this way was pretty unique. Yeah, pretty unique for that time.
Still today, they still don't like women teaching.
Some places, yeah.
Some still don't want women in the pulpit.
Yeah. So although the name of God isn't mentioned in the book of Esther, the Jewish people still recognize his hand at work. Here are some of the places I noticed the move of God in today's study. 1, Esther delaying her request to rescue her people. 2, the king being unable to sleep. 3, the choice of reading material to help him sleep. 4, the timing of Haman's entry into the outer court. All of that was really, really pretty amazing. And 5, the chamberlain spilling the beans about the gallows. It seems to me throughout this story that the chamberlains had come to a place where they favored Esther. It was more than just the ones that worked closely with her. And they knew a lot. They're like the waiters and the ones who are always around and don't say a lot, but they hear a lot. But all of these things work together to undo Haman's plot to hang Mordecai. And the plot to kill the Jews.
That's kind of sad. There's like one man who's hatred for that one man who took out a whole race.
Yep.
And people allowed it. I mean, because if you said his family was involved, I'm sure there was other people that had the same mind.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. And that has happened a lot with the Jewish people over the years, that they become we know about in World War II. They become the ones that are looked down on as the the scapegoat, as they say, to be the ones that people don't like, and then we're all of the ills that come to us are because of the Jewish people, and this has happened over and over and over again, and then God delivers them over and over and over. So what we want to take from this is to look for, you're talking about the hiddenness, and we want to look for and acknowledge God's move in our lives. And one of the other things I didn't really get into like I wanted to, but was about Esther's, the meaning of hiddenness and the meaning of her two names, the one of hiddenness and one of righteousness, being righteous. And we see so many ways in which, when we compare her to Haman in particular, the righteousness versus the hiding, the deceit, the trying to hold on to wrath, not letting go of things. Anyway, that's what I have for tonight. And I think everybody did. Are there any other questions or comments? Or
I have another one. This world is kind of like where Haman was wanting wealth, and he was all about himself. But Esther kind of started out all about herself. I mean, she changed. He just got worse.
Right. And it was a little different with Haman. Was all about himself and promoting himself. Esther was all about protecting herself. If she had been about promoting herself, when the king said, "Ask for what you want, up to half of the kingdom," she'd be like, okay, I'm going to keep hiding who I am, and I'm going to tell him I want half the kingdom. And once he gives me half the kingdom, then it won't be as easy for him to kill me, right? Like, you could think through all these little things, and that's where the hiddenness and the righteousness, the doing what's right for others, not just doing what's right for herself, or not doing what her own mind was telling her to do, right? I believe that we can find examples of God's love and God's grace and all that in the king. The king was not perfect, right? He's not a complete example of God. There's things in there about him where he was known to, or especially in history, they seem to be that he was easily swayed. People come and say, "Hey, why don't we do?" They're like these people aren't listening. They don't worship the way we do, or they don't listen to your laws. They don't listen to your laws, and so let's kill them all. But let's not do it now. Let's do it. I mean, it didn't make much sense, right? But he signed it. Like, sure, let's do that. And some of it was about money for him. Um, but I think Mordecai also, it does say in the Bible or in the book there that Esther always did what Mordecai told her to. And Mordecai was giving her good guidance. He was giving good instruction to her. And I think that can also be an example of the relationship with God. All right, well, thank you all. And we will not be having prayer at the church on Saturday. So be praying on your own at home. All right. God bless.